Well, we're still in Genesis. We're looking at in the 37th chapter. We've got the 12th chapter now. His brothers, Joseph's brothers, went to pasture their flocks near Shechem, and Israel told Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields and asked him, "What are you seeking?" And he said, "I'm seeking my brothers. Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." And the man said, "They've gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. And then that's out of sequence because he hadn't gotten there, he hadn't found them, but they saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams." And when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood. Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him." And the pits were cisterns. They're supposed to be collecting water. Lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands and restore him to his father. Now, that clause is telling us what's in Reuben's mind, what he's thinking or imagining or planning. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves, or if you're reading an old translation, the multicolored robe that he wore. And they took him and they threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. And then Judah said to the brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers agreed. And now it switches to Midianites now. Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. And when Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where can I turn?" And then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. And they had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found. See now whether it is your son's robe or not." He recognized it, and he said, "It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." And then Jacob tore his garments and put on sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Okay. Well, you may want to just hurry on and get on to all of the intrigue down in Egypt, but there are some things that are in that story that we haven't touched on, and they might be instructive to us. Hopefully so. Well, where I ended up was that the brothers decide to sell him to the Ishmaelites, but somehow these Midianites come along and they grab him up, and then they sell him to the Ishmaelites. Anyway, this seems like like I said, a pretty clear weaving of two stories together, and like I said, the ancient redactor felt like he was working with Holy Scripture and he couldn't just edit things out at will, and so he left a lot of extra things in there that makes it confusing to us today who are used to pretty good editing. Although, come to think of it, I tend to find lots of typos in things that I read, and I think, how could they miss that? But anyway, the the Ishmaelites and Midianites were a part of the story that reinforced the sense of trade routes, and all of that made sense. But anyway, when Reuben comes back to the cistern with his plan to rescue Joseph and take him home, he found that that cistern was empty. So evidently Reuben was not told and clued in on the Ishmaelite, Midianite plan to sell him into slavery. And so we don't know at this point of the story whether he's bereaved because he thinks his brothers killed Joseph anyway, and that's why he's gone, or does he believe that, and does know that he was sold into slavery, but feels like he's totally lost anyway, and that Reuben has lost this opportunity of gaining favor with Jacob. And that's another thing that's lost to him. Or is he bereaved because he is the eldest and he failed to take care of his brother? And he failed in his moral leadership of preventing this terrible crime to be committed. He thought he had a plan and he thought that it would work, but then when it didn't work, then he failed in his leadership of keeping his brothers under control and not wandering off the straight and narrow path of righteousness and justice, but into crime. So the tearing of the clothes, as I was got to last week, was a common expression of grief. In the biblical times, we read that often, the tearing of clothes and the putting on of sackcloth and ashes, and Job sitting in an ash heap and so forth. We also see that Jacob tears his clothes and he puts on sackcloth as well when he hears the story. So we know that Jacob's mourning is very great. And we're told that neither sons nor daughters, and we're not sure who the daughters are, that they could just be daughters-in-law, or they could be the unnamed daughters because daughters weren't very important to the ancient male writers of the stories. But anyway, in the mentioning of that, I don't know if you noticed it, but there's only Jacob's grief. They don't mention other people's grief. And so we don't hear of Rachel's grief if this story has her still alive but not gone. And there's no mention then of Jacob trying to console Rachel if she's still alive. And no mention of Rachel's trying to console Jacob. And neither do we hear of Leah's feelings or Bilhah or Zilpah's feelings offering to console any consolation there, or their feeling of any grief. And neither do we hear rejoicing. The brat is dead, he's gone. We don't hear that side of it. But anyway, in this story, we do have the tearing of the clothing and the sackcloth and the ashes as the common biblical expressions of grief. Now, we know today, and in my work with bereavement, we understand that there are things that are common about the way people grieve, and a lot of it is cultural in the way that we are taught and that we're learned, either by someone telling us or just by observing. When a lot of times we have people wonder whether they should bring small children to the funeral. I mean, it's a good question. I remember it's really a sad day, we had a young mother who sadly had started smoking heavily as a teenager, and in her 30s died of lung cancer. Well, she had a little girl. Her youngest was maybe 4, and they brought her to the funeral and at the graveside, and I remember the little girl walked up to the casket at the graveside and asks, "Is Mommy in the box?" Yes, Mommy's in the box. But, children can't process things at an adult level, so we don't really know how children will be processing things, but they learn from example and modeling. We have so many examples that we see when great funerals are put on TV, and the way a nation mourns when some tragic death happens and it's at some place then of someone famous, then so many people bring some token of something, flowers, teddy bears, messages, as their way of grieving. So we see different ways and styles of grieving. But we learn those by example, and a lot of times what we're taught, what we're told that is expected of us, the respectful way or important way to show our grief. One of them is just wearing dark clothes. Lots of folks may not have a suit, and so I've done a lot of services where some younger member of the family had to go buy a suit because they didn't have a suit in order to come to the funeral. Young women have to go get a black dress. They don't happen to have that basic black dress. So anyway, these are ways of demonstrating or showing both our grief and respect. But sometimes there's an initial shock of the loss, and it sometimes makes a person just numb with disbelief. They're lost for words, and often lost for the feeling words to express what they're feeling, but can often just kind of retell the story or the facts of the death and seem very composed and able to do that, but they can't quite get in touch with the feelings because they're still numb from the shock. And sometimes an outside observer may think that this calmness is a sign that that person really didn't love that person that much, because they're not upset, or they don't seem to be upset, but the observer doesn't recognize they're still in shock. It hadn't really sunk in yet. And anyway, but sometimes there are some cultures or subcultures within our country where some people learn by example or modeling in their family that there is a big emotional display, deep weeping and crying and so forth. And but anyway, that initial reaction is sometimes misconstrued as a measure of a person's depth of feeling for the one they've lost. But as I say, sometimes it's just the shock and the numbness. Then there's other times that I have observed that, and it just speaking of appearances, because I haven't really gotten to talk to these particular individuals sometimes, but in some situations, the most distant and unattached and disconnected, and by observation would seem the basically most uncaring and unloving family member, judging by their prior lack of involvement, lack of concern, not being there through a prolonged dying process, that at the funeral time seem to exhibit the strongest outward display of emotion. Now that emotion, from my study and reflection, sometimes can be all of a sudden they're overcome by a lot of guilt because they hadn't been there. and or maybe grieving the lost opportunities for the closeness and for maybe the reconciliation of if there had been something happened that had caused some alienation. But it is sometimes viewed, as somehow fake or just a show, and I pick that up because some family members have commented that to me, as they're seeing this family member who hadn't been around much and hadn't showed much concern. All of a sudden, why are they so emotional at the service? And the ones that have been there for the long hours and the long process of caring for this person in the dying process, sees this one who hadn't been there. Why are they so emotional? They never seemed to care before. So anyway, it does create some curious experiences, all of which could be that we have our public grief expectations of how we show our bereavement, and then there's the personal inward part. Here at Boston Avenue, most of our families, the public grief is very quiet and very reserved. We don't tear our clothing, and we don't fall down in a heap weeping uncontrollably. We don't scream with rage against whatever we believe took our loved one, whether it's disease or doctor mistake or fate, a drunk driver or a gang shooting. We just pretty well hold it in and hold it together. We may have those feelings, but we don't let them out and are not real demonstrative about it. But one thing that our cultural experiences often is a real difficulty when the death has come and we're almost certain of it, but there's not the body to be able to do our grieving and farewell with. A body isn't recovered in order to say goodbye. Now we know that the 9/11, where thousands of people were just obliterated as the towers came crashing down, and the explosions there and the fires. But here, with Joseph's death, there wasn't a body to take home. And actually, he didn't die, but as far as Jacob and the and the other parts of the family that didn't know what had happened, there was not the body for whom they could perform the funeral rituals and have the normal cultural ways of grieving and beginning the healing process. The tsunamis and great earthquakes and floods and these terrible landslides and mudslides where people are buried and their bodies aren't recovered. It leaves the family without that physical body of their loved one in order to put to rest and in the ways that are meaningful and helpful for them. Now, in ancient societies, and sometimes not so ancient societies and cultures, have a ritual where family members actually bathe and prepare the body. On the death of Jesus, the women going to the tomb, they couldn't do those tasks of preparing the body because it was Sabbath. But they were going to do those rituals when they found that the body was gone, the tomb was empty. But some people would bathe the body, and then a lot of times in our early times here in the American experience, the men would build the casket. They'd get together and they'd build the casket. They would physically dig the grave. And so the people had ways of dealing with the saying goodbye and showing love and care for the remains. Or even if they're going to have a cremation, as in some cultures, they would build the funeral pyre and prepare that. But in our culture today, we've sanitized death and grief, and in much of the ways we outsource the care of the body. We outsource that. Now, as much as I am around it, I'm probably less sensitive than most, But I really don't want to return to the hands-on preparing of the body as in olden days. It might be psychologically healthy, but it's not our custom. We're not used to it, and I'm not used to that. But I do like some of the simpler ideas for burial, like some of the green or environmental concerns and consciousness about the embalming that puts lots of chemicals in the body that then gets leached out and gets into our soil and water sources, depending on how long. I'm just thinking of the creek that runs through Memorial Park, and with all the rains, how much of all the embalming stuff gets leached out of the soil into that creek and then downstream. Anyway, there are some concerns about we don't need to do that. But because of public health concerns, if you're not embalming, then that body really needs to go into the ground pretty quickly or be cremated fairly quickly. And then the other things, we have the beautiful wooden or steel caskets, and then the concrete or aluminum vault that's put in the ground. And all of that has two things. One is the idea to preserve the body, but the body is not preserved. It decomposes fairly quickly anyway, and is put back into God's plan for nature, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust understanding. But some ideas now are of a woven basket that doesn't waste a lot of resources in order to carry the body from one place to the other to put the body in its final resting place. Although it's our custom and our culture, really aren't open to that, but there are a few cemeteries that I've seen advertisements for. If you're a real strong environmentalist and naturalist, that there are cemeteries that say you can have a plot here, and we don't do all of that. One of the big things about the vault, the concrete or reinforcement vault, is for perpetual care of the cemetery, so that it can all be flat and it can all be mowed and kept nice, and you don't have a burial and then all of the body in the casket decay, so that it goes have these dips after a while. So anyway, a lot of questions and issues about our ways of grieving and preparing the body and saying goodbye to the body. But the point here is Jacob didn't have that opportunity for expressing his grief at the loss of Joseph. And so he could not be consoled. The sons and the daughters could not console him. And I'm just, from my experience, I'm thinking a part of the reason for that was not having the body to grieve over and to say goodbye to. That may have been part of why he was stuck in his grief and so forth. But anyway, now I found that Rabbi Sachs, and the Jewish rabbi scholar, has written lots of essays on the Genesis story, and there hadn't been any for a while. But once we got to Joseph, he's got a whole bunch of essays about this part of the story. And the first one is an analysis of Reuben, the brother who tries to save Joseph but fails. And I found, did most of you just kind of go on with that and let's hurry and get down to Egypt and see what happens next? But we're not going to do that, because I think this is a very fascinating analysis. Sachs tells us that the story of Reuben is a story of potential unfulfilled. Potential unfulfilled. Virtue not quite realized. Greatness so close, but yet unachieved. Sachs puts the episode of the brothers tending their flocks far from home, when Jacob sends Joseph to check on them, he says, on this encounter, the whole future of the children of Israel depends. Now that's a pretty bold statement. This one incident is the watershed of how the whole future of the children of Israel will go, and it all kind of rests on Reuben. The brothers recognize their chance to eliminate Joseph. Their isolation in the wilderness presents the opportunity to do harm without witnesses. In other words, they've got a plan for the perfect crime. But only Reuben protests at the initial time. Well, just for, not harming him. Sachs points out that the text states that, quote, but when Reuben heard it, that is their murderous plot, he delivered Joseph out of their hands. Delivered Joseph out of their hands, saying, let's not take his life. But Sachs points out, Torah, the Bible, does something in that verse that it does nowhere else in all of Hebrew Scripture. He says it makes a statement that, construed literally, is obviously false. Anybody catch how it might be false? Well, how it is false is, the verse says, Reuben saved Joseph from their hands. He took Joseph out of their hands. But he didn't. But the text says he did. He didn't take him out of their hands. So Reuben failed to save Joseph from their hands, and the verse states what might have been, but not actually what turned out. Reuben's plan was simple. Don't kill Joseph outright and have blood on your hands, literally, but throw him in the cistern. And the thought there is, throw him in the cistern and let him die of hunger and thirst and exposure. Don't kill him outright, but cause his death a different way. So, again, a rarity for Scripture. It describes a character's thoughts. Usually we only hear the actions or the words spoken, but rarely the inner thoughts and feelings. So, like the grief, how do they say that he felt deep grief? He doesn't say he felt deep grief and sorrow. He just said he rent his clothes and he said. He rent his clothes and he said, but he didn't. They don't talk about thoughts and feelings other than if they give voice or the action. And then we interpret the feelings. Reuben's thoughts, his plan, was to rescue Joseph when the brothers weren't paying attention to the cistern. Now we realize that Reuben is not present when the Ishmaelites and the Midianites come by. So when he finally comes back to rescue Joseph, he finds that he's gone. And then this, oh, woe is me feeling. Now Sachs fills in on the Midrash commentary of the Hebrew scholars, which say, quote, if Reuben had known that the Holy One, blessed be He, would write of him, meaning that God would inspire these words to be in the Holy Script, that God would write of him with these words, and if Reuben heard that, then that he heard what they said and saved him from their hands. If Reuben had known that would be what was said of him for all time, then he would have picked Joseph up on his shoulders and carried him back to his father right then. That's what the Midrash, he found a quote there. Of course, now the Midrash author would be viewing Joseph as a young boy. I mean, Reuben wouldn't pick up a grown man upon his shoulders and carry him all the way back, but he's got a vision of a younger boy who could be picked up and carried on one's shoulders. But Sachs comments with a question, did Reuben really need God's approval before rescuing his brother? Would he need that approval before doing what was the right thing that he knew in his heart and with his ethics and morality? That question is critical in assessing Reuben's character and critical to our own moral dilemmas that sometimes come into our lives where a situation presents itself and we have a choice. What should we do? And the future is unclear of how the situation may turn out. But in this case, Reuben is the Hamlet of Genesis, he says. Hamlet of Genesis. To be or not to be, that is the question. To be the hero or not. Anyway, and he goes on and quotes some lines much farther down from that initial part of the speech. Native hue of resolutions is sicklied or by the pale cast of thought. Resolutions are sicklied by the pale cast of thought. So if you stop to think it out and too much, then you lose the opportunity. We have another expression, if you snooze, you lose. Well, Sachs points out that what we see in Reuben by this short episode are these things. He's a person of good intentions. He thinks, and he's not led by the crowd, what everybody else is thinking or wanting to do, or by maybe his own darker feelings and instincts. He holds to a higher value system. And he penetrates to the moral core of the situation. But then secondly, he goes on, we know about Reuben also is that his interventions tend to backfire instead of making things better. Things get worse. And so why does he say that? Well, Sachs says that the Torah, or the redactor of the final version, wants us to reflect upon Reuben's character. And there are several little vignettes along the way that accumulatively give us a composite of Reuben and his character. And the first one that he picks up to remind us about is in the fields during the wheat harvest. And it's interesting that it's a wheat harvest because most of the time they're sheep herders and goat herders. They're not plowing the ground and planting wheat and harvesting. That's something that would connect to Joseph in Egypt and later on. But anyway, at the wheat harvest, Reuben finds some mandrakes, and this is some kind of plant and root, which was believed to be both an aphrodisiac and a fertility drug. And Reuben wants to give these to his mother, Leah. He's not thinking of himself, but about his mother, and he knows that she feels unloved, and that he understands her anguish, and he hopes, we assume, that she can use these mandrakes and win Jacob's attention, and possibly the fertility aspect help her also be fertile and produce more children, but mostly that aphrodisiac aspect of winning his love, because he knows of her grief of feeling unloved. However, what happens is it brings about negative consequences because it provokes this bitter row between Leah and Rachel, the sisters. For Rachel sees the mandrakes and wants them for herself, if you'll remember. But Leah answers her, "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes as well?" Y'all remember that from back in 30 verses 14 through 15? Anyway, but Sachs, who studies these much longer and deeper than we have, realizes that this is the only time that angry words are reported between the sisters. We know the feelings of grief and all of Leah, but we don't have, any bitter, harsh words between them recorded. And that's kind of interesting because they don't talk much. It's kind of like they stuff so much of the feelings, and there's not much communication in this family, not real clear. And so a lot of stuff's undercurrents are always going on. But anyway, Reuben tried to help his mom, but he creates a situation that causes this ugly scene between the sisters, and I guess as it works out, his hope for the use of the mandrakes didn't work out. And I guess Rachel probably got them or took them or whatever. And so anyway, so the next situation after that was when Rachel had died. Jacob set up a pillar over Rachel's tomb on the way to Ephrath, and then he moved on to Migdal Eder. But while Jacob is living in the region, we're told, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine Bilhah, and Israel heard of it. Now we pondered some different ways of understanding and looking at that, but Sachs tells us that a literal rendition of the text indicates that Reuben took his father's place in Bilhah's tent. Now Sachs refers to a famous Hebrew scholar, Rashi, who's following the Midrashic tradition, to give another interpretation. Y'all want another interpretation? It's kind of interesting. Well, Rashi suggests that when Rachel died, instead of sleeping alone in Rachel's tent, Jacob or Israel moved his bed, Jacob's bed, from Rachel's tent to Bilhah's tent. Now, Bilhah is Rachel's handmaid, and since Rachel had given Bilhah to Jacob to make a baby that she couldn't make, but that then Rachel could adopt or just take as her own, that made, in that giving statement, gave her as wife. So Bilhah is a concubine wife or a third-class kind of wife. We'd look at Rachel as first-class wife, Leah as second-class, Bilhah as third-class, and Zilpah as fourth-class wives. Anyway, this for Reuben was an unbearable provocation. It was unconscionable, intolerable that Jacob would once again reject Leah. That is, not move his bed to Leah's tent. If number one wife dies, then number two wife should move up and take number one wife position. But instead, Jacob chooses the handmaid Bilhah over Leah. Therefore, Reuben moves Jacob's bed. He just goes into the tent, drags Jacob's bed out of Bilhah's tent, drags it over to Leah's tent, and moves it in there. And I would suppose Reuben then would go back to Bilhah's tent in order to make it awkward and uncomfortable for Jacob to drag his bed back in there. That's interesting. This, just describing it that way, I've brought up the image of our little poodle in his little bed. If I move that for any reason, he goes and gets it, and he drags it back to where he wants it. So anyway, he's a funny little dog. But anyway, so I had said before, the closeness, maybe he was just there either seeking comfort for himself or comforting Bilhah, who had been the handmaid of Rachel, and she would have been deeply bereaved probably. And but anyway, this has a different possibility there. But anyway, we understand Jacob interpreted it as an act of sleeping with one of his wives, and therefore an act of usurpation, taking over the leadership or the chieftainship of the clan. In verse 49:4, 10 chapters away, when Jacob's giving his deathbed blessings to the different sons at the end of his life, he's saying to Reuben, "Unstable as water, you will not be preeminent. For you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it." So we still have that interpretation being played out. several chapters later. But the text that we're dealing with, it ends kind of abruptly when it says, "And Israel knew of it." And he's saying that stylistically, when you cut a sentence in half in the middle of a paragraph and make a paragraph break in the middle of a sentence, that has a stylistic message that words don't need to be conveyed. He says it indicates silence, a complete breakdown of communication. And then, so that's what happened between Reuben and Jacob, a breakdown of communication. This, again, not talking, stuffing and holding in feelings and not getting it out and being clear. So, in this different interpretation, Reuben is not trying to usurp Jacob's leadership role, but is trying to call his attention to how hurtful he was being to his mom Leah, seeking comfort in his grief from the handmaid instead of Leah. So that's an interesting interpretation. But as I reflected on that, I got to thinking, it would be somewhat awkward for him to go to seek comfort from Leah, even if she was grieving the death of her sister. Another part of her being would have been relieved that her great nemesis was now gone. But it would have been hard for her to comfort Jacob, whose deep grief only would remind her of how much he loved Rachel. And the more he expressed that deep grief and great love for Rachel is then a contrast to how little he loved Leah. And then with that dichotomy and her saying that, "Oh, well, I'm so sorry, let me comfort you, you jerk," it would have been difficult. And anyway, so that would have been awkward. Now, the next vignette Sachs brings up is Reuben's birth, and we remember the trick that Laban had in getting Jacob liquored up at the wedding feast and then in the dark sending in Leah instead of Rachel to consummate the marriage, and then making Jacob promise 7 more years of labor in order to get Rachel after a 1-week kind of honeymoon with Leah. But anyway, in that we have that Leah was not loved, and so God recognized that and opened her womb, but we don't know when she conceived. Was it that during that week honeymoon that she conceived and then discovered several weeks later that she had conceived and was now pregnant, or was it years later? We don't know the timeline there. But anyway, but then when the baby is born, it says Leah names the son. Ordinarily, fathers would name the sons as a way of claiming them as theirs, but Leah names the son Reuben, which means see a son. And then it is because the Lord has seen my misery, surely my husband will love me now. But not so. But she has another son, and Sachs spells his name Shimon, Shimon, but our text calls it Simeon. But anyway, the Lord heard that I am not loved. He gave me this one too. Still hoping, still producing sons that hopefully could make her finally lovable. But Reuben becomes aware of this absence of the love and absence of the involvement of the father. And Jacob doesn't name the son here either, but Leah does again. And we remember it's Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah were Leah's sons. But what we see here is that Reuben will also feel that neglect and that absence of love. I once read someplace in a parenting kind of thing that the most important thing that a man can do to raise emotionally healthy children and secure children is to truly love their mother. That's the most important thing that a husband can do for his children, is to really love their mother. If you do nothing else, do that, was the message there. But the result for Reuben growing up with this unloved mother and this distant father was a lack of or a shortage of confidence in himself, this uncertainty that he felt, that at critical moments robs him of the capacity to carry through a course of action that he knows is right. In his ambivalence, he's using valuable reasoning power and time to plan carefully or to act decisively. His mind is occupied with this uncertainty rather than being certain and then making a good plan or just acting, knowing it needs to be done. The mandrakes, he should have bided his time and presented the mandrakes privately to his mother. And regarding the beds after Rachel's death, rather than playing games underhandedly with this bed moving thing, that would have made a pretty funny, if someone put that in one of these movies about Bible times. I think I'll send that off to somebody. Maybe I can get a little commission for for being a consultant for movies. But anyway, that would be kind of crazy, doing all those shenanigans instead of just stepping up to his dad and confronting him and calling him into account, man to man. Do you realize what you're doing? This is not right. You don't know what would have happened, but it would have been better than his dad assuming that he was having sex with Bilhah, but rather it was about something else entirely. Anyway. But we also see in Jacob's behavior that he didn't deal directly either. He never did really step up and confront Laban all those years. You know, he played these games with, the different sticks and the breeding of the sheep and the goats with the spotted and black and white and mottled and all of that. And then when Laban and the other sons were off far away, that's when he chose to sneak away and run away. He wasn't a man-to-man, let's talk about it, let's deal with it kind of person either. And so Reuben had grown up with that kind of model and example. But anyway, with this rescuing of Joseph's situation, had Reuben put his foot down and used his eldest son authority and said, this is wrong, and then taken Joseph home back to his father, then the story would have had an entirely different outcome. But instead, he hesitates. He puts off a real confrontation with the brothers, and he tried to be sneaky about it. He tried to be sneaky about it instead of standing tall and stepping right out and doing what was right. He hesitated, and he lost the opportunity to be a hero and to do what was right. Well, Reuben had high ethical sensibilities and a conscience, but he lacked courage. He lacked that strong self-confidence. He knew what was right, but he lacked resolve to do it boldly and decisively. In hesitation, more was lost than merely Joseph. Reuben lost the chance to be that hero he might have been and should have been. So, back to the Midrash comment. If only Reuben had known that the Torah would write of him, then Reuben, that word, he heard and he saved Joseph from their hands. If he knew that that's what the Torah was going to say of him, then he would have gone ahead and done it and saved him. But he hesitated and it didn't happen. If he had known that was what history was going to say in that line, then he might have had the courage to carry through that action. But Sachs says that none of us can read the story of our life beforehand and know what we should do. We can only live it as it comes. We live it in and with uncertainty. And doubt can lead to delay until the moment is lost. And in a moment of arrested attention, Reuben lost his chance to change history. Well, a lot of us are confronted with those decisions, like I said, and I had some I was going to tell you about and wrestle with, but we only have time for me to read the last two paragraphs of of Sachs' analysis, and actually these are kind of like sermons, and here's the conclusion. Reuben could not read his story, but we can. If there is a single verse in Tanakh, or the Hebrew Scriptures, that stands as a commentary on his life, it is the inexpressibly poignant line from Psalm 27:10, "Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me." Jacob, being human, loves some, not others. God, not being human, loves each of us, and that is our greatest source of strength. God heeds those not heard. He loves those whom others do not love. Reuben, still a young man, did not yet know this, but we, reading his story and the rest of Tanakh, do. We are here for a reason, conceived in love, brought into being by the one who brought the universe into being, who knows our innermost thoughts, values, good intentions, and has more faith in us than we have in ourselves. That, if only we meditate on it, gives us the strength to turn intention into deed, lifting us from the person we might have been into the person we do become. We all have a calling and a purpose. Sometimes we realize it, and sometimes we hesitate, and we miss opportunities for making a significant difference. If only, let us pray. Dear God, you are the one who wants not only the best for us, but you want the best that is already in us to be expressed in the words we say to one another and in the actions that we take. So help us meditate and get close to you and be sensitized and energized and encouraged to do all the good that we can. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.